Israel Business Weekly is sponsored by the PLFA Foundation.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Israel Business Weekly. I'm Sarah Williamson. Thank you for joining us. Today we are partnering up with Signal to bring you a 1-hour special edition that unpacks the strategic and economic relationships between China, Israel and the Middle East. Coming up on the show. China's presence in the Middle East is mostly based around oil and their ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. But we speak to the experts who tell us it runs much deeper than that. We also speak to a Chinese scholar and professor who lived in Israel and the Palestinian territories during the Second Intifada. They tell us what life was like. And Israel Studies is gaining popularity in universities all over China, Signal being the brains behind the initiative. Thank you once again for joining us here today. Before we go any further, I want to introduce you to Carice Whitty, founder and executive director at Signal, Sino-Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership. Carice, let's begin the broadcast by telling the audience a little bit more about Signal is and what it is that they do. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Signal is an academic and policy research organization. We are based in Israel, and for the past decade, we've been bringing a more informed understanding of Israel and the region to China's policy advisors, experts, and universities. Israel is also focusing on China on the government side, so we bring a more informed understanding of China to the government and private sector. And although China might seem far away from Israel, it's here in Israel, here in the Middle East. And we thought it was important to partner with I24 and do this co-production in order to allow your viewers to get an opportunity to hear from the people in the region and Chinese who are dealing with the region.
And of course, we are going to continue to unpack that within the next hour, and we are going to come back to you later on in the broadcast. So do hang tight and let's begin. China's growing influence around the world has sparked a variety of reactions in many countries where China is active. That's just as true in the Middle East. Senior international affairs correspondent Owen Altman takes a look at 3 of those Middle Eastern countries, and then our guests will tell you about a few more.
Each country in the Middle East has its own way of seeing China. Let's take a look at 3 of them. 1, Iran. China is a potential ace in the hole for Iran. With sanctions from the U.S., with rocky ties with Europe, China could give Iran the money Iran needs to run its economy. There's a multi-billion-dollar deal in the works. For Iran, there are big risks, but potential rewards. 2, Egypt. The Egyptians also want Chinese investment, port projects, a new capital city. The Chinese are very active. 3, Syria. To rebuild his country, Syrian President Bashar Assad will need someone with deep pockets. The Russians can't afford it. The Americans aren't interested. And the Europeans would tack on too many conditions on human rights. That leaves China. If, in return, Assad can give China something China wants, like a military base or serious port access. These are just 3 examples. We'll leave it to our guests to tell us more about how China looks from their neck of the woods.
I'm now joined by Stam Kamil Saeed, National Council of the Quran Movement Party in the Kurdistan region in Iraq, and Jonathan Fulton, Assistant Professor at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. Now, Jonathan, I want to begin with you. On the surface of this relationship, it seems to be based on China's need for oil in the Middle East and the Belt and Road Initiative. But you've pointed out to me previously that the relationship runs much deeper than that. Can you elaborate on what else makes this relationship so important?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity to meet with you today. I think when you look at the China-UAE relationship, oil only tells a very small part of the story, actually. If you look at China and Saudi, for example, it's much more heavily dominated by its oil interests. But the UAE represents a pretty unique country in the GCC in that it actually sells a lot, it buys a lot more from China than it sells to it. So China does buy quite a bit of energy from the UAE, but the UAE's re-export dominated economy is quite interesting because typically China sells a tremendous amount of goods to the UAE, and then those get sold to the rest of the region. So the UAE actually represents a very important economic partner for China in a much more well-rounded manner than other Gulf countries do, which tend to be mostly an energy-dominated trade, whereas the UAE is a much more multifaceted one.
Now, Stam, I want to bring you into the conversation here now too, as China is the world's largest oil importer since 2017, which Iraq is being one of their main suppliers. How important is China's investment in Iraqi oil to their economy?
To your question, I think Iraq provides about 12% of China's energy, and that's quite, for a huge country like China, this is very important for China to grow economically and for the China's political class to rule. And that's the main reason, I think.
Okay, Jonathan, I want to go back to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. China will continue to develop its comprehensive strategic partnership with the UAE and promote high-quality joint construction of the Belt and Road. What does the UAE get out of this, and why are they so eager to strengthen this alignment?
Well, there's a lot of factors at play here. One of them for the UAE side is that China is obviously a rising global power with tremendous interest in the region. This is important because the UAE has always had to develop relations with extra-regional powers as a survival strategy in a pretty competitive region. And typically that's been the role of the US or the UK. But I think everybody's learned the lesson of the past few decades that a diversification of relationships is very important. So for the UAE, they look at China and they see a rising power with deep interest in the region. And also, this is important, a very positive vision of how the Arabian Peninsula fits into its long-term plans. And I think this is interesting because typically when you hear Western countries talk about the Middle East, it's typically in quite negative terms as a problem to be solved. Whereas when China looks at the Middle East, the way they typically frame it is it's part of this Silk Road narrative of this positive link in a larger foreign policy initiative that links China's long-term strategy. So I think this is quite an attractive narrative to be part of.
Absolutely. And Stam, Beijing has often opposed Kurdistan's secession from Iraq, but an independent Kurdistan could be extremely lucrative for China, as Kurdish oil producers frequently offer more favourable deal terms to foreign investors than Iraqi government-owned oil companies. In your view, why is China holding back support for the Kurds?
I think there are several reasons for this. The main one, I would say, is that China's political doctrine is based on absolute sovereignty. When this is translated into policies and practices, China does not want to intervene into politically intervene into other countries' issues, especially when it comes to the issue of minorities. As you know, that China, in this regard, on the issues of minorities, is very vulnerable. China does not want to open that door for other countries to intervene in their own country. The second reason, I would say, is geopolitical. China does not want to lose its closest allies, for instance, Iran. If China would have backed up the Kurdistan referendum, this would cause collateral damage in China-Iran relations. And I think the third reason for that, it was that was economical. China works closely with central Iraqi government, and as you know, the issue of referendum deeply divided the Kurdistan region with the Iraqi government and caused so many problems. That's why, on that matter, I think China chose Iraqi government instead of the Kurdistan region.
Okay, gentlemen, do stick with us because we are going out for a quick break. But when we get back, we continue our conversation with Stam and Jonathan about how the Middle East views China. Plus, we speak with Ma Xiaolin, a professor at Zhejiang International Studies University and former journalist in Kuwait, Gaza and Iraq.
The Middle East. i24NEWS is a witness. Our journalists live and breathe there every day. Get all the latest global news from our studios in Tel Aviv, New York, Washington, and Paris. Anytime, anywhere. Download the i24NEWS app, available on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple, and Google stores. i24NEWS, see beyond.
Discover i24NEWS Radio. Now you can listen to i24NEWS anywhere, anytime, for free. i24NEWS Radio is the audio live stream of the television network with world headlines every 30 minutes starting from 7 a.m. Tune in for top news, magazines editions while in the car, in your office. Join us from your smartphone, tablet, or desktop to stay connected in the Middle East and around the world. Don't wait any longer. Head to our website or mobile application and click on i24NEWS Radio to subscribe.
Israel Business Weekly is sponsored by the PLFA Foundation.
Welcome back and thank you for sticking with us. I'm still joined by Stam Kamil Saeed, National Counsel of the Quran Movement Party in Kurdistan, Iraq, and Jonathan Fulton, Assistant Professor at the Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. Gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking with us. Now, Stam, I want to begin with you. Now, in July 2009, UN ambassadors from 50 countries, including Iraq, signed a joint letter to the UN Human Rights Council defending China's treatment of the Uyghur Muslims. Now, Iraq, being a Muslim majority country, signed this. Now, how is it viewed by the general public in Iraq?
I think this is a very important question. The general public in Iraq reacted very empathetically to this suppression or massacre of Uyghur Muslim in China. But when it comes to the issue of massacre and genocide, I think Kurdistan region and Kurds very specially and quite empathetically reacted with that crime. And I will tell you why. Because as a Kurd, as a big minority, stateless minority in the Middle East, we have been through so many genocide and massacres in the last century or so. So we feel the pain. For us, the Yazidi genocide is still new. The Afrin massacre is still new. The Kobani massacre is still new. Anfal massacre, Anfal genocide is still new. So I think the Kurds very empathetically reacted to that. And I think it's the humanity's responsibility to stop that crime. It's not only a crime against humanity, it's also a crime against diversity.
And Jonathan, Iraq was not the only country to put a signatory on this letter as well, the only Muslim majority country. Rather, we also had signatures from the UAE, from Bahrain and Saudi Arabia. At the end of the day, the Gulf has what China wants, and that is oil. So why is the region so hesitant to call China out on this?
Well, first, I think it would be remiss of me to not push back a little. I mean, the characterization of it as a massacre or a genocide is wildly it's incorrect. It's an internment, and there's a lot we can say about it, but I think it's important to be precise. I think what most countries in the Middle East, I mean, there's been something like 26 countries, I think, that signed this letter, Muslim majority countries. One thing that's important, I think, to consider in this case is that China has framed the situation as a response to religious political ideology that challenges the state. And as Stan rightly pointed out, sovereignty is a very important consideration for the Chinese government. When they see what's happening in Xinjiang, they see a separatist movement that's trying to pull away from PRC. I think if you look at a lot of countries around the Middle East, especially in the Gulf, you'll see that there's an alignment in this, that many countries also feel that religious political ideologies also present a threat to regime stability in a lot of countries. So I think when China presents it as a response to a political ideology stemming from religion, I think this is something that actually resonates in a lot of countries that especially see threats from groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for example.
Okay, and Jonathan, throughout the Trump presidency, we saw his main foreign policy efforts focus on China and the Middle East. Now, with the new administration, do we think we will see a shift in foreign policy agenda in relation to China and the Middle East? And how does the US influence the relationship between the two?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how the Biden administration approaches this. I think that overall, the U.S. interests in its relations both with China and with the Middle East aren't going to significantly change. I think fundamentally they'll be quite consistent. But I think what will change is the approach that the government uses. If you look at a lot of the foreign policy programs that have been rolled out that specifically focus on China over the Trump administration, most of these have revolved around military responses, whether it's been through the National Security Council's 2017 National Security Strategy or the Department of Defense, which issued one in 2018. We haven't really seen much from the State Department. And I think that's important because what we see over the period of the Trump presidency is very weak secretaries of state, and a State Department that's been quite minimalized in a lot of the policy decisions. Obviously, Joe Biden has a long history with the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. He's coming into the presidency with a very deep personal pool of expertise in foreign relations. And I expect to see him approaching these relations in a more diplomacy-focused manner, whereas under the Trump administration has been very much a military-first approach. I'd expect to see a Biden administration have a very similar policy, but a different approach.
Okay, and Stam, China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative has already been accused in recent years of serving as an instrument of debt trap diplomacy. With Iran's national debt already so high, this makes them particularly vulnerable. What kind of negative impact could Iran's decision to join the BRI have on the country?
I think in the long run, I assume, is that this will negatively impact on Iraq's sovereignty on its affairs. It's imbalanced relations, as you rightly pointed out. This trap diplomacy has problematically worked on in other cases in the region. So I think the main negative thing for this project would be on the Iraqi sovereignty. As many people know, Iraq goes through a very difficult time internally and externally as well.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for with you, gentlemen. But thank you so much for joining us, Stam Kamil Saeed and Jonathan Fulton. It has been an absolute pleasure having you join us here today.
Sure.
Thanks for having me.
When we talk about the United States in the Middle East or Russia in the Middle East, we often talk about geopolitical rivalry and intrigue. With China, it's a bit different, at least for now. Senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman looks at what Beijing sees when it looks at the region.
A quick take on what China wants in the Middle East. 3 key points. 1. Oil. An expert once told me, China is like a whale. It needs to eat. And in the Middle East, at least for now, China needs oil. Oil to power a country of 1.3 billion people. In 2019, almost half of China's oil imports came from the Middle East. 2. Profit. China wants to sell and invest in the Middle East and to make money doing so. The Middle Eastern market has more than 350 million people, ripe for Chinese exports and capital. 3. Access through the Middle East to Europe. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative comes in, a huge Chinese government project meant to connect China to the world. The Middle East is a natural link between China and Europe. And so the Chinese have built railroads, ports, and industrial parks throughout the region. In all of this, China wants to stay out of the conflicts of the Middle East. But in the long run, can the Chinese do so? In order to achieve their goals, the Chinese need a stable Middle East. And with the U.S. potentially pulling back from the region, China may have to get more involved.
And for more of what China wants in the Middle East and how their presence is developing with time, I want to bring in Professor Ma Xiaolin, professor at Zhejiang International University and long-time journalist who has spent several years covering the geopolitics of the Middle East and has lived all over the region. Professor Ma, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you spent time living in Israel and the Gaza Strip between 1999 and 2002, when the situation went from extremely optimistic as far as peace prospects and then soon quickly turned into a situation of major violence on both sides. Now, what was it like working with both the Israelis and the Palestinians during that time, trying to navigate your way through the region?
Thank you for your invitation for this program. I reported witnessed and so many rounds of peace talks, but finally, I think that the peaceful efforts forward and both of the two parts involved in violent stories. I think it's very big pity. I think there's some problem, particularly the last statute issues, including Jerusalem, settlement, refugees, border. It's hard for you to decide how to divide this Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is the holy city for Arab world, for Islamic world. Secondly, for example, I think that the border division is easy, and West Bank or even the Jordan River Valley controlled by which side is easy, but the problem is the refugees, you know. Right now, there are more than 5 million Palestinian refugees outside Palestinians, and inside the population, more lesser. So who have the right to decide the refugees outside can return or not return?
Okay, and Professor Ma, speaking of security in the region, now that the US is starting to scale back their presence in the Middle East, do you think that this will now make room for China and will see them want to strengthen their political and security footprint in the Middle East?
So many Middle East countries look forward and China to be more big player in the region, including Israel and the Palestinians. But actually, I think China is still weaker and as a big giant to replace American. Totally, China is weaker, less so much than United States. I think in economy and military and diplomacy, China is learning to be a big player in Middle East, because Middle East it's a new place for China. It's a river of troubles for China.
Okay, I want to take a look at the Syrian civil war now, because Iran and Russia were allies when this first began and with their involvement. But now the two parties are at loggerheads over who has a bigger presence. But where does China fit into all of this? I mean, are they willing to step in, considering the economic presence to be gained by assisting in rebuilding Syria and therefore also gaining access to the Mediterranean Sea?
Yes, as we know, China has no direct interest in Syria. China did something in Syria, firstly, I think, to help Russia, because we have a special relationship, as you know. Second one, China want to keep Syria united and stable and growing up economically. And also, I think a united Syria is good for Israel. And Russia and Iran and even Turkey has no money. China has money, really. China has so many the experienced companies to build this country.
Okay, Professor Ma Xiaolin from the Zhejiang International Studies University, thank you so much for your insights. It's been a pleasure having you join us today.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
See you next time. Now it's time to go out for another break, but don't go anywhere. Next up, we discuss the technical relationship between Israel and China, two high-tech powerhouses forming close ties over technology. We discuss the upsides and downsides to this bond when we get back. Stick with us.
Zoom in, past the sound bites and beyond the numbers. Zoom in, between the people and into the Middle East conflict. I'm Jeff Smith. Together, we'll zoom in Sunday through Thursday nights, only on i24NEWS.
A fresh primetime lineup, the largest international news network broadcasting live from the Middle East. At 6 p.m. Eastern, The Rundown will take you live inside the day's top stories and breaking news. Then at 8 p.m., Global Eye will take you on a journey through the day's big events with voices from all over the world. And at 9 p.m., we'll zoom in even closer on the big stories, the ones that you're curious about right now and we'll still be talking about tomorrow.
We're on the inside of political and religious passions in Jerusalem, breaking down the financial trends shaping the global economy, giving you key context, not just headlines, with the stories from Israel that touch the U.S. and those across the region with impact far beyond its borders. Sunday to Thursday on i24NEWS. Catch the Rundown, where the Middle East meets the world.
Look out the window. What do you see? Because the world is changing as we speak. I'm Natasha Kirchak, journalist, traveler, and host of Global Eye, your window to the world. From the hub of Tel Aviv, we are bringing you the biggest stories trending around the world directly from the people on the ground. Because our world is more interconnected than ever before. Global Eye. Join the global conversation.
The correct way to wash your hands. Wet your hands with water. Use a generous amount of soap. Rub your hands together, palm to palm. Place your palm on the back of the other hand, intertwining the fingers. Place your palm together using the fingers. Place the backs of your fingers in the palm of your hand. Rub your thumbs in a circular motion. Rub your nails against your palms in a circular motion. Rinse your hands with water. Dry your hands using a clean towel or absorbent paper. Use a towel to close the tap. Your hands are now clean and safe.
i24NEWS team of talented correspondents are working hard for you. They're in the markets, on the streets, in the battlefields, getting the pulse of the story. Tune in for Beyond the Headlines to see how the top stories of the week are affecting real people. No commentary, no debate, just the best stories presented by our best journalists.
Israel Business Weekly is sponsored by the PLFA Foundation.
China is on the hunt for technological know-how, and that hunt has brought it to Israel. In Israel, China's moves in buying and investing in tech has often been welcomed. But as senior international affairs correspondent Owen Alterman explains, China's activities have not been free from controversy.
Artificial intelligence, biotech, food tech. China wants to buy, Israeli companies want to sell. So what's the problem? Well, on one hand, maybe there's no problem. Deals are being done all the time, including last month, a $106 million investment in the Israeli company i24NEWS and its work in 3D imaging. On the other hand, experts point to at least two clouds in the sky. One, is Israel, the innovation nation, giving away the store? China is savvy in snapping up know-how and then turning it into technology of its own. Buy low, learn fast, and then conquer international markets. Israeli companies may not be getting from China what their assets are actually worth to China. Two, the United States. Israel's most important ally is not happy seeing China buy sensitive high-tech. In Washington's eyes, China is in a global competition with the United States, and Israel is selling China technology that, in theory, could help China win. Even with Joe Biden in the White House, expect this to continue to be an issue in U.S.-Israel relations.
And for more, I'm joined by Dr. Jiao Longchao, former diplomat in charge of Science and Innovation and International Innovation Cooperation expert, and Itamar Grotto, Associate Director General at Israel Ministry of Health. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Now, Dr. Jiao, I want to start with you. Why is China reaching out to countries like Israel for technology instead of developing it all at home?
It's very good to be here. This reaching out, I would say, is an integral just part of the Chinese just opening policy. Engaged 40 years ago, the Deng Xiaoping opened the country in 1978. And economically, we really have integrated the world economy by just entering into the World Trade Organization, WTO, just 2001. And then, just last month, we signed the regional comprehensive economic partnership agreement that will be just a free trade zone accounting for 1/3 of the global GDP. And in terms of technology, science and technology, China has already signed just international intergovernmental SMT agreements with our totally just 114 countries, and including Western countries. In the case of Israel, just one year after the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and China in 1992, we also signed the same just SMT agreement with Israel in 1993. And then just at the beginning, that was mainly just a science cooperation. The two governments put together just $5 million USD to support science projects. But later on, I would say there is a big interest from the business communities on both sides. So I would say it's really a kind of mutually beneficial cooperation relationship.
Mr. Grotto, I want to get your opinion on that. What can Israel do for China when China is such a major tech player globally and Israel is such a tiny country? What does Israel have that China might want, for example, in the area of healthcare innovation?
Of course, by some measure, Israel is much smaller than China, and we know that. But in some ways, China and Israel have much in common, especially when it comes to healthcare. Both of our population are becoming older. We both experience rising pressure on waiting times in hospitals and rising cost of healthcare. Plus, the advancement of medical technology present both of us, our nations, with crises and with opportunities to grow together. The main area that brings China and Israel together is healthcare, is what you said, what was mentioned here, healthcare innovation. It is a perfect match for both of our nation's strengths. As China's Prime Minister and Israel's Prime Minister said during the state visit to Israel, Israel has earned a reputation for innovation and technology, and China has mastered the art of growth and scale. So China, as mentioned by China's Vice President, rightly said that both are needed, innovation and scale. So Israel, as one of China delegation said in this delegation, Israel's technology and innovation can take you from 0 to 1. China's powerful ability to scale can take you from 1 to 1 billion. So I think by cooperating and matching our strengths and strengths, we can help China move forward faster, and we can make the world a healthier place together.
Okay, Dr. Zhao, tell me more about China's shift from being a manufacturing powerhouse into an innovation powerhouse.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think innovation is really a necessity for countries' just future development. First, our just labor costs are increasing rapidly. So it's something like 10% increase for the labor cost since 10 years. That means we have been just losing our competitiveness just for those labor intensive just industries, something like clothing, shoes industries. They are now moving to lower income countries like some Southeast Asian countries. Second, we really need to address societal challenges by just innovation. I would like to take the example of climate change. Just our president just announced the commitment of China to reach CO2 emission peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. That means just a big shift for the energy structure, and we have to just develop clean energy industries and as well just in other sectors like energy saving and environmental protection. And we need to really find those solutions by innovation, and not only find the solutions, but also to make those solutions costly effective. So I would say innovation is not a kind of option, it's a kind of just necessity for the country.
Okay, and Professor Grotto, given China's ageing population and people's rising expectations about healthcare quality and delivery, do you see opportunities for Israeli innovation and technology in the medical field despite the difficulties of penetrating the Chinese market?
Well, of course. First of all, coping with the challenge of aging the population and rising healthcare expectation is an important area where both China and Israel are truly coming together, and where Israel has something to value share. Israel has 90% patient satisfaction rate at home, top-tier ranking by international health measures, one of the lowest cost per capita and highest life expectation in the world. So we are very efficient. Also, when it comes to innovation and technology in the medical field, Israel is widely recognized as one of the world's leaders in healthcare innovation. While some find it difficult to penetrate the Chinese market, we have found our cooperations and healthcare agreement in China to be harmonious and beneficial to all. Some examples include the signing of an implementation agreement with the mayor of Yangzhou. China is in an online ceremony for the implementation of the emergency preparedness project in the city. This is a strategic project signed by the Israeli Prime Minister and Vice President of China that combines Israeli expertise, technologies, and information systems in the field of emergency preparedness. We also have an agreement with China's Hainan province to write a clinical feasibility study as a first step in establishing the first rehabilitation hospital in the province based on Israeli knowledge and expertise. The key to our shared success is combining technology with medical knowledge and integration of technologies. When we bring together everyone's strength, it's a mutually beneficial cooperation. We hope to continue and grow our partnership and cooperation in China, to continue leading technology with medical knowledge, and to save lives and shorten China's path to success.
Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen. That is all we have time for. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much.
And we're going out for one last break, but when we get back, we take a look at Israel's studies in China.
The Middle East. i24NEWS is a witness. Our journalists live and breathe there every day. Get all the latest global news from our studios in Tel Aviv, New York, Washington, and Paris. Anytime, anywhere. Download the i24NEWS app, available on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple, and Google stores. i24NEWS, see beyond.
When the news cycle never stops. Zoom in, past the sound bites and beyond the numbers. Zoom in, between the people and into the Middle East conflict. Together, we'll take a deeper dive into the history and the relationships that are driving today's conversations. I'm Jeff Smith. Together, we'll zoom in Sunday through Thursday nights, only on i24NEWS.
Israel Business Weekly is sponsored by the PLFA Foundation.
When most of us think about university students studying Israel, we probably picture them studying in English. But there's a whole other world out there. Israel studies in Chinese. Senior International Affairs correspondent Owen Alterman looks at the movement growing in strength across China.
In 2011, there was not a single course in Israel studies at any university in China. Today, more than 20 Israel studies programs. And every year, around 2,000 students in China learning about Israel. Now, there had been Jewish studies in China for decades, but Israel itself was too hot a political potato. With the warming of ties, that changed. And it also changed through the work of Signal. Year in, year out, Chinese faculty come to Israel for a full semester. Israeli professors barnstorm across China in people-to-people interaction. But it's not about Israelis flying in to teach about Israel. This movement is driven by Chinese faculty teaching Chinese students in Chinese. Signal has been a pioneer in making all of this happen. And from China's perspective, China wants to be an all-purpose superpower, which means studying every nook and cranny in the world. China also wants to be a leading innovator. Maybe those Chinese students feel that by studying Israel, they can unlock the secrets behind Israel's innovation.
And to learn more, I'm joined again by Carice Whitty, who pioneered the Israel Studies program in China, plus Professor Aryeh Sapoznik, Associate Professor at Ben-Gurion University and Vice President of the Association for Israel Studies. Plus, I'm also joined by Professor Sway Shojun from the Executive Director of Middle East and African Studies at Renmin University. Thank you all so much for joining me. Now, Carice, I want to begin with you. Now, you developed this entire program in China. What made you want to develop Israel Studies as a program in China in the first place?
So I am a Zionist, and I really wanted to give back to the country I love. But in 1987, when I made Aliyah, there were no official relations between China and Israel. So my Yale University degree in Chinese studies and all those years I had spent in the mid-'80s working in China, learning the language, were not really useful. But then in 2009, after the subprime global economic crash, I started to look at what was happening between Israel and China, because they both came out of it pretty well. And I learned that there was no study of Israel in China at all. Then in 2010, when I was gearing up to start the program, China was declared the world's second largest economy. And at the same time, China said it was going to transition from being a manufacturer to a global innovator. And that cinched it for me. Definitely, China would eventually be coming to Israel for innovation. It would need more energy from the Middle East. And it was critical that China would learn about Israel at the university level, especially places like China Foreign Affairs University that produces most of China's ambassadors.
Well, let's talk to someone at one of those universities. Professor Sway, I want to bring you into the conversation. You are a professor at Renmin University, one of China's top 5. Now, I understand that you originally reached out to Signal back in 2014 to bring Israel Studies to the School of International Studies at Renmin. Why did you consider Israel Studies to be so important?
All right. So China is becoming a global power in economics and politics. But if you look at China's study priority, it has long been focused on the U.S. study and also UN study. So we need to reach to the regions, areas. Israel is a very important country in the Middle East. So there are 4 reasons why Israeli studies are so important in China. The first, I think China, Israel, or the Jewish people, Chinese people, we have a very good friendship. It can be traced back to the Second World War. We all know that a lot of Jewish refugees came to Shanghai and in order to escape their persecution from the Nazi Germany. So the second reason is Israel is a small country in size and population, but a big country in technology and innovation. And China is steadily pursuing its road under modernization and industrialization. So I think it's really science and technology could be very complementary to China's, persuasion to be a modern socialist country. So we can gain strengths from the interaction with the Israeli scholars to study other countries in the region. The last but not least is Israel has a very good higher education system. There's a growing number of Chinese students. They want to go to Israel to pursue their degree study, both as a master or the PhD candidate. So these are all the reasons why I think we should strengthen the Israeli study in my university.
Great. And Professor Sapoznik, last year Signal sent you to China to give a series of lectures on Israel Studies to its partner universities. Now, you have lectured at quite an international set of students over the years, yet you have said that lecturing in China was a real eye-opener. Tell us a little bit about your experience and why it was so eye-opening.
It was. Well, I'll tell you, in fact, we have an international master's program here at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for Israel and Zionism. And we find that every encounter internationally with Israel studies sheds new light on the study of Israel itself. And going to China was particularly interesting. The kinds of questions and the kinds of motivation for interest echo what we've just heard. I think there's a lot of interest in Israel as a high-tech leader, and a great deal of interest that's closer to my own research perspective
in terms of two nations, two peoples that have ancient roots and that have created modern cultures at the same time. And so the kinds of encounters with faculty and students that I had in China were incredibly enlightening, both in both directions. I was able to learn a great deal, not only about Chinese culture, but in fact, new perspectives on Israel studies itself.
Okay, Carice, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation. You were working with over 20 universities in China, from the eastern border right over to the far west. Now, this is 3,000 universities in this country. How do you pick which universities to work with, and where do you decide where to go?
Well, it's definitely a process. We are looking at the universities and understanding where we can be most effective. One of the reasons we've been able to be successful is because we're basically dealing with Israel itself and Israel's strengths. The fact that Israel is an innovator, as you heard, is a key interest of these universities. Other universities are very interested in the fact that Israel is a regional power. But one of the most important reasons that many universities are interested in working with us, and we have quite a wide choice, is the Belt and Road Initiative that was launched by President Xi Jinping, because as China is trying to move goods from the east to Europe, they recognize that Israel is a land bridge connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So because we identified these interests and we were able to reach out to universities and offer them the opportunity to learn about these critical areas, we were able to choose universities that were most relevant to us.
And Professor Sway, you mentioned about there was many Jewish people that had migrated to China, and we know that Jewish studies is something that has been studied in Chinese universities for decades, as Owen mentioned in his report earlier on. Is there an overlap at all between these areas of study?
Yes. Jewish study has long been existing in Chinese university, but roughly they can be divided into three categories. The first category is a Hebrew language study. In China, there are a lot of several universities they are teaching on the language study. So Hebrew language is one of the important languages they are teaching for decades. The second category is about the history study. In China, there's quite a number of universities. They have a well-established disciplinary to study the history, the Jewish history, and also Israeli history, Middle East history. The third category is a university that study the contemporary political and economic of the Middle East. And my university, for example, is established my school established in 1950 by Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. After this country founded in 1949, immediately that the Chinese authority realized it's very important to strengthen China's international politics study. And then we know that we have to focus on contemporary economic and political study or different region and area. So Middle East is very important for China, particularly since the Belt and Road Initiative was launched by the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So Middle East, as Chris put out, is a land bridge to connect China with the Europe. So in this background, and we need to strengthen the study of the region. There are a lot of important issues like the oil politics and the Iran nuclear issue, and also the peace process and many other issues. So we are focused on contemporary economic and political studies of the region.
Okay, now, Professor Saposnik, we tend to take for granted the culture that we grow up in, and given that the Chinese students do not have a Judeo-Christian background and many bits of knowledge and information built into our culture and society, basics that we take for granted are not there, what is it like to teach Israel studies?
So you're in fact correct. There are certain things that we do take for granted in teaching Israel studies, certainly to Western audiences. Zionism, for example, resonated and echoed many biblical motifs which are familiar in Western culture. These often have to be explained to students or even to faculty who do not have that same background. But at the same time, as I said earlier, this notion of ancient cultures and their translation into the making of a modern national culture, which is a phenomenon that we're very familiar with in the context of Zionism and Israel, this is something that resonates, I think, very powerfully, as I've found with Chinese students who have asked me a great deal about the making of modern Hebrew culture and its relationship with ancient Hebrew culture. And so bridging some of these gaps, there are certainly areas of interest that are mutual and that can be shared.
Okay, and Carice, before we finalise the show, just one more question for you briefly. If there were no Israel studies courses in China prior to 2011, how did you find university faculties to teach about Israel, and how do you prepare these educators so that they're well versed on how to accurately teach about Israel studies?
Well, we work with the Chinese faculty, and we bring them to Israel and give them an opportunity to experience Israel. I think many of your viewers know how valuable it is to actually be here. So when they come and they can feel the land and meet the people as well as study, they are able to go back and integrate Israel into their area of expertise. And our advice to them is don't take anything for granted.
Absolutely, that is a good message. Carice Whitty, Professor Sway Shojun, and Professor Aryeh Sapoznik, thank you all so much for joining us. That is all we have time for this week on Israel Business Weekly. I hope you have enjoyed this special broadcast. If you want to learn more about Signal, you can head to their website, sinoisrael.org. And if you want to hear more from us, you can head to our website, i24news.tv. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. See you then.